So we begin, and Herodotus begins his story of Persia not with armies but with a dream. The choice is revealing. He is less interested in administrative mechanics than in how power is remembered and justified. The Median king Astyages, ruler of a people who had recently overthrown Assyrian dominance, dreams that his daughter, Mandane, gives birth to a vine that spreads over all of Asia. The dream is interpreted by the magi, or the priests or dream interpreters, is in the only way that they reasonably can. Mandane's child will overthrow his grandfather Astyages. Astyages responds as Near Eastern kings often do. He attempts to hold off the future by murdering his grandson, or murdering him just as soon as his pregnant daughter can give birth. Now, Mandane has been married off to a Persian noble of modest status, a man called Cambyses, but specifically chosen because he seems incapable of producing a dangerous heir. When a son is born, Astyages gives the child to his cousin and chief minister Harpagus, with explicit orders that the baby should be killed and that no blame should attach to the king himself. At this point, Herodotus pauses to let Harpagus speak for himself. Harpagus cannot do it. He must do something. You do not openly disobey an absolute and paranoid king. On the other hand, even with her nonentity of a husband, Mandane will be the next ruler of the empire. She will not think well of the man who stole and murdered her son. So Harpagus bullies one of the king's own slaves, a mountain shepherd, to do the dirty work and to keep his name out of it. He orders the shepherd to take the child back to the mountains and to expose it there. The shepherd takes the child, goes back to his home in the mountains. As chance would have it, though, his wife has just given birth, but she's given birth to a dead baby. The shepherd and his wife look at the big and pretty baby that's been stolen from the palace, and they think, why don't we expose our own dead baby and keep this one? Seems a good idea. So the shepherd substitutes the bodies and raises the king's grandson as his own son. This is not history in the modern sense, or it doesn't seem to be. It does look like mythic history. Think of Moses, think of Orestes, think of Romulus and Remus, think in some degree of our own Lord and Saviour. Children who escape murder attempts by the powerful and grow up to realise their destinies as great leaders. But if myth, this is myth with a purpose. It explains Persian power as something inevitable, resisted, but unstoppable. Years later, the child reveals himself not through prophecy, but through behaviour. Playing games with the other boys, Cyrus is chosen as king by his peers. That is, he becomes the leader of a local gang. He issues commands. When the son of a nobleman disobeys him, Cyrus has him beaten. The incident reaches Astyages, who summons the boy and questions him and realizes the truth. The dream has not been avoided, it has only been postponed. Astyages spares the child. The magi, for whatever reason, tell him not to worry. But he doesn't let Harpagus off. Oh no, he does punish Harpagus in one of the most notorious episodes in ancient literature. He summons the son of Harpagus, a boy of 13, jumps on him, kills him, has the body cut up and cooked in various inventive ways. His father Harpagus is then invited to a banquet. He eats heartily. He loves the dinner. Only when the meal is finished is he shown the severed head and feet of his own son, whom he has just eaten. Herodotus doesn't soften the story, he doesn't excuse it, he presents it as an illustration of royal cruelty and of patience and revenge. And on this slide I've given a nice picture, a copper engraving by Matthias Merian the Elder, 1593 to 1650. You can imagine this has been a popular story for a very long time. I've also given an artificial intelligence attempt at generating an image. It's quite a good image, except that the boy has fewer fingers than he needs, and Harpagus is looking more openly upset than, according to Herodotus, he was. You see, Harpagus doesn't make a fuss. He can't make a fuss. All he can do is bow and say, "It is as your majesty requires." Harpagus doesn't make a fuss. He doesn't rebel immediately. But this is the East. He waits. Years later, when Cyrus leads a Persian revolt against the Medes, Harpagus ensures that Astyages' army defects at the crucial moment. The dream is fulfilled, the Median kingdom collapses, Persia replaces it. Whether or not the story is true in the sense that it happened doesn't matter. It tells us how Persians and Greeks alike understood Cyrus, a man whose rise was resisted by human cruelty, but guaranteed by fate. Once in power, Cyrus behaves very differently from Assyrian kings. He doesn't rule through mass terror. He doesn't deport entire populations as a matter of routine. He defeats kingdoms, but he then absorbs them, and he leaves much of their internal structure intact. And this is not kindness, it is strategy. Around 540 BC, Cyrus conquers Babylon. There are some good stories around the conquest of Babylon, but when I'm giving lectures of this kind, I need to be selective, and so I'll have to pass that over. Do read Herodotus yourselves, you won't be disappointed. Let us turn to the next conquest, and this is the important conquest as far as the Greeks were concerned. Cyrus decides to expand westward into Lydia, a wealthy kingdom ruled by Croesus, a man whose name became and remains synonymous with great riches. Croesus, feeling threatened by Persian strength, consults the oracle at Delphi. Should I attack the Persians now, or should I wait until they become still more powerful? The oracle sends back a reply that if he attacks Persia, he will destroy a great empire. Croesus assumes the empire in question is Persia. He gets his army together and rushes out to invade Persian territory. He attacks. He's defeated. He hurries back to his capital Sardis, but the walls of Sardis don't keep the Persians out. Croesus is captured, and Cyrus, the great king of Persia, condemns him to be burned to death on his own funeral pyre. While sitting on the pyre and waiting for the flames to put him out of his misery, Croesus calls out the name of Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who once warned him that no man should be called happy until he is dead. And again, I wish that I could pause to tell that story, but I can't and I won't. The important thing about it is that when Croesus calls out the name, "O Solon, Solon," Cyrus is interested. Cyrus comes closer to the fire and through an interpreter calls up, "So, who is this Solon?" Croesus tells him an abbreviated version of the story, and Cyrus is struck with pity. Here he is burning another human being to death. He shouldn't be doing that. So he orders the flames to be put out. However, the fire has now taken possession of its kindling and are rising higher and higher. At this moment, Croesus looks to heaven and cries out, "Apollo, I've always been good to you. I asked one big favour of you and you let me down. Will you do me a favour now?" At once the sky clouded over and it began to rain. The fire was put out. Croesus was brought down from the funeral pyre, and he and Cyrus became good friends. Is this a true story? I rather think it is. If you look at that Greek pot on the right hand of the slide, this was produced only about 30 years after this alleged event. There may be something in the story. Certainly it was widely believed, but the anecdote matters less for its literal truth than for its meaning. Greek readers are invited to see Persian power not as blind savagery, but as capable of restraint and reflection. Whatever the case, Lydia has now been incorporated into the Persian Empire, and this is the real significance of Lydia's fall. You see, when Lydia falls, so also do the Greek cities of Western Asia Minor, cities like Miletus, Ephesus, Phocaea, and many others. For the first time, Greeks become unwilling subjects of a Near Eastern empire. Oh, they had already been conquered by Croesus, but he was so notably pro-Greek that he was almost accepted as a Greek. Cyrus in his place was another matter, and so this is the moment when Greek and Persian history become inseparable. Before we pass on with the main narrative, however, let us return to the Persians. Their empire is something new in Near Eastern history. It is multi-ethnic, it is multilingual, it is flexible, it governs through local elites, not permanent garrisons, it respects local ways. It does all this not out of benevolence, but because this is the most efficient way to rule large territories. Later sources confirm this image. Here is Xenophon writing a few hundred years afterwards. He wrote a biography of Cyrus, which contains a certain amount of truth and a certain amount of falsehood, but it is still very interesting. But here is what Xenophon has to say about Cyrus. "And those who were subject to him he treated with esteem and regard as if they were his own children, while his subjects themselves respected Cyrus as their father. What other man but Cyrus, after having overturned an empire, ever died with the title of the father from the people whom he had brought under his power? For it is plain fact that this is a name for one that bestows rather than for one that takes away." So there is Xenophon, a Greek writer who visited Persia, and I might say more about his visit to Persia later in the course. Let's turn to the Old Testament, Ezra, and Cyrus is an important man for the Jews. "In the first year of Cyrus the king, the same Cyrus the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be builded, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations thereof be strongly laid, the height thereof 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 80 cubits, with 3 rows of great stones, and a row of new timber, and let the expenses be given out of the king's house. And also let the golden and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple which is at Jerusalem, and brought unto Babylon, be restored, and brought again unto the temple which is at Jerusalem every one to his place, and placed them in the house of God. You see, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had taken Jerusalem, and he deported all the Jews to Babylon. When Cyrus conquered the Babylonian Empire, he allowed the Jews to return and to rebuild Jerusalem, which makes him very significant in the history of the Jews, which in turn makes him very significant in our own history for reasons that I hardly need to specify. But let's move on. Look at the image on the right. It looks like a rather large stone sweet corn, but this is the Cyrus cylinder. It's written in Babylonian cuneiform, and it presents Cyrus as chosen by the gods to restore order while respecting local rights and customs. Modern commentators sometimes call this the first declaration of human rights. This is possibly anachronistic. It's better understood as a declaration of imperial pragmatism. Whatever the case, I do believe a copy of this is in the front entrance hall of the United Nations building in New York. The Persians did not demand cultural uniformity. They demanded obedience, they demanded tribute, they sometimes demanded men for their army, they always demanded stability, and so long as these things were provided, local traditions could continue, and the system worked. It worked remarkably well in most parts of the Persian Empire. It didn't work so well among the Greek subjects of Persia. Greek political culture was fragmented and competitive. Persian imperial rule relied on indirect governance through compliant elites. In most parts of the empire, this was straightforward. There was an obvious local elite. In Greek Asia Minor, it wasn't. The Greeks had no agreed ruling elite. The Persians could only choose between factional leaders. Whatever one they chose was guaranteed to be hated by more than half his subjects. Because of this, the seeds of rebellion were already planted.